All right, so we're constantly told to be original, in inverted commas. But what if I told you that the secret to revolutionary creativity isn't invention, but something far simpler, far more common? What if the greatest artists throughout history were actually thieves? So I want to dive into a concept that changed how I approach every design brief and every life decision. And it's the idea of stealing like an artist. It's the core theme of Austin Kleon's influential book, Steal Like an Artist. So there's a problem with originality, right? The blank canvas fear is real. When we try to invent something entirely new, it's easy to freeze. It's easy to feel paralyzed by choice. So we end up with a diluted, uninspired result because we're not drawing from the well of inspiration, which is actually natural to humans and natural to creativity, in my opinion. So if we look more specifically at one of the greatest creatives ever, I think, certainly in recent history. We've got David Bowie, South London boy, grew up near where I grew up, actually. So shout out to Bowie, I guess. But when he was asked in a 1976 Playboy interview whether he considered himself an original thinker, his reply was phenomenal. This is great. So he says, not by any means, more like a tasteful thief. The only art I ever study is stuff that I can steal from. I do think that my plagiarism is effective. Why does an artist create anyway? The way I see it, if you're an inventor, you invent something that you hope people can use. I want art to be just as practical. So he saw art as practical and usable. He wasn't afraid to admit he took things, and he said that the more he gets ripped off, the more flattered he gets. It's the whole imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But the distinction is key. Bowie is a tasteful thief. He was a tasteful thief. He took ideas and principles and he didn't merely reproduce them at surface level. Okay. If you think about someone who copies versus someone who's a thief, right? Copying is superficial and quite snaky, right? If, and you know, the normal way of considering stealing isn't that great either. But if something gets stolen from me, if my phone gets stolen with all the different edits and stuff that I've got, or if the way I do videos or whatever is stolen, you know, someone's going to need to take it and put themselves in it and make their own thing from it. Okay, they're stealing the how, not the what, right? And this is what Kobe always said as well. He said, "Copy the how, not the what." How did they do it, right? To me, stealing is defined by that kind of process more so. Copying is not thinking deeper than surface level. It's looking at, okay, what is it that's created and how am I going to create the exact same thing? Stealing is more about the process, I think. So this all, David Bowie's quote brings us to the core of the episode, which is about building our own creative lineage. This leads nicely into this creative lineage, which is also from Cleon's book. It's the exact opposite of plagiarism. So, and I found this super inspiring. Is there a way to create a family tree of creative influences that allows us to inherit their genius without becoming a cheap imitation? Right. So, this becomes part of a kind of system to steal tastefully. This family tree. So, we've got us at the bottom, and then all of our favorite artists up the top of the tree, and we can have different connections and different inspirations between them all. And we take different elements from different people. In the same way that our genetic lineage, we take different elements from different people in our family, we have a creative lineage as well, right? So, and I think it's good to have this in some kind of tangible format. With AI, we can do this quite easily, right? So you could get Gemini or like the banana thing that it's got now. You get it to say, all right, can you create some kind of like family photograph, like from the 80s or something, where I'm the child, like on the floor or whatever it might be, and I have my greatest influences around me, and it's almost like a family, you know? And that way you see yourself more as a part of a lineage rather than copying superficially what's happened, what there is there. It forces you to think in the same way as your influences rather than to just copy the same things that they did. And it's not only, the stereotypical starving creative that needs to do this. One of the best and most influential and most famous painters of all time, Pablo Picasso, said, good artists copy and great artists steal, right? Again, copying is surface level imitation. Stealing, as a great artist, is about taking the how. It's about taking the method or the philosophy and integrating it so deeply that it becomes part of our own creative DNA, right? And the lineage that I'm talking about is like a design database. So when we face a challenge, we're not starting from scratch. We can reference the greats. We can have almost our own cabinet meeting with these greats and think, like, how would they advise me? What would they say? And this is where it comes down to reading about these greats, reading about what they would do, what they would say. So then we can actually have that cabinet meeting in our heads. I'm sure that with AI going forward, it's going to be even more easy to do that in a more tangible way. So we can think, what would Virgil do? What would Kanye do? You know, what would all these different people do? Whoever it is that influences you to do this, what would Martine Rose do? You know, what would Wales Bonner do? Some of my favorite designers. This transforms the work from imitation to like paying homage to, again, part of a creative lineage. So I've spoken before about a three-stage process to creating or to stealing, and it's not new. In fact, one of the most flourishing artistic periods in human history, the Renaissance, followed this exact three-step structure to ultimately transcend their own influences. And I think it's something that we can do across any time horizon, whether the project is a day, a week, a month, or years, or life. Like life is a project as well. So the three stages of the creative process that the Renaissance proved is the path to genius are as follows. So this is just my thesis about it. So there's the replication phase, there's the mastery phase, and then there's a transcendence phase. Okay, and this is mirrored in the Renaissance, spanning the early, the high, and the late Renaissance periods. Okay, this is something that I studied. I studied history at university and at school. I got a Scottish master's for my undergrad, and then I got an English master's for my postgrad in history. So I looked at this a lot, and I was pretty obsessed with it. And just to really illustrate this, I've got an example from each stage of the Renaissance to illustrate what it is I'm talking about. So in the early Renaissance, this replication phase, this copying phase, right, this stealing phase, we can look at Donatello's David. I'll let you Google Donatello's David, but it's a bronze sculpture depicting David from David and Goliath, the story. So Donatello with this sculpture was an example of artists or sculptors trying to replicate the statues from antiquity, right? That is what typified the early Renaissance to an extent. So Donatello directly revived classical principles absent in Gothic art and the medieval era. Okay, specifically things like the contrapposto pose, which is where all of the person's weight is. We all stand in contrapposto a lot of the time. All of your weight is on one foot, and it means that your hips and your shoulders kind of are at an angle, like they kind of sag. They're at a diagonal rather than standing up straight. So he revived the contrapposto pose, which was very common in antiquity, in the ancient period. And he also revived the idealized nude hero. And he drew heavily on ancient Greek and Roman sculpture to portray David in this way. So it's a beautiful copy and revival of a lost art. Not necessarily lost, but of an artistic style that wasn't as common. That almost, I guess it kind of got lost. And then in the High Renaissance, if we continue with David, the story of David and Goliath, we've got Michelangelo's David, probably one of the most famous sculptures from the Renaissance. Now, Michelangelo, he was a bit of a polymath, sculptor, painter, architect, and it can be said that Michelangelo's David, is an example of achieving mastery over antiquity. He mastered the style. So he took the classical ideals, the nude form, the contrapposto, and the anatomical detail, and surpassed them by adding profound psychological depth, right? This example of David isn't triumphant, it's tense. He's focused before the battle, he's wary. And this was a metaphor for Florence at the time. Florence as a city being wary of other cities looking to invade, looking to conquer it, okay, looking to invade Florence. So it's an example of Florence's strength as David over the Goliaths, which might have been Milan, for example, at the time. Okay, it's important, like just a bit of context. Italy wasn't unified Italy at the time. It was kind of like different states, different nation states, right? So Michelangelo's David was a masterpiece that uses the stolen principles, but adds another layer of emotional and an intellectual complexity beyond the original inspiration, but it still underpins that original inspiration. He's not necessarily gone beyond it, he's just mastered it. He's just given it a more humanistic element, right? He's made it into something, he's almost perfected it, right? And then we move to the late Renaissance. So I'm going to move away from the story of David and Goliath quickly and talk about the Last Supper. So if we talk about the Last Supper, a lot of people will think about Da Vinci's Last Supper. There are many examples of the Last Supper that were depicted during the Renaissance, but Da Vinci's Last Supper, we all know it's been recreated a bunch of times. It's a table, it's very geometric. We're looking straight at the table. It's a long table, almost like at a wedding, you know, the long table at the top. And you've got Jesus in the middle and all of the different disciples or whatever on either side. And there's a lot of action in it, but we're looking straight on at it. Tintoretto's Last Supper, painted in 1594, completely warps this whole depiction, completely warps the perfect geometry and the symmetry of paintings throughout the Renaissance before. There are plenty of examples of paintings in the early Renaissance and the high Renaissance that were very geometric and very kind of front on and very symmetrical, right? The symmetrical beauty. So Tintoretto was this Venetian painter and a key figure in the Mannerist movement. And he moved past antiquity almost entirely, creating new forms. He broke the static, balanced compositions of the high Renaissance, for example, in Da Vinci's Last Supper, and he placed the table at a steep, receding, diagonal composition. Look this up, all right? It's a beautiful painting. He used extreme like contrast with the lights and the shadows, and he included mundane details like servants and a dog alongside angels and biblical figures to blend the earthly and the heavenly, right? And with this, we get a completely new dynamic. You can almost hear the painting. There's so much going on. There's so much drama and contrast. And it's an emotionally charged narrative that demands us as viewers to actively participate in the consumption of the painting. And he does this from moving past the rules of the high Renaissance. He's moved past this idea of embodying or replicating antiquity, right? So there's these three stages. There's copying, there's mastery, and then there's moving past it. And in modern times, in design especially, we can look at, okay, what is it that, for example, if we're looking at Virgil, right? Virgil Abloh, what is it that Virgil did? Okay, so we've got off-white, we've got the quotation marks, we've got the what's it called, the X like thing for off-white. There's Pyrex, there's what he was doing at Louis Vuitton, there's the DJ and all this sort of stuff. There's the what, and we can try and copy those elements, right? There's also architecture, right? He was an architecture by trade. He was an architect by trade. We can try and copy those whats. We can try and copy what it is that he did to an extent, and learn more about what it was that he was doing. And then eventually we can start to master what it is that he was doing. We can master the how. We can look at how it is that he was doing it and master it ourselves. So the X from Off-White, I think, was inspired by Glasgow Airport logo, the logo from Glasgow Airport. The quotation marks was because like nothing's too serious. Everything's a little bit sarcastic. That's the way he was thinking about it. Work at Louis Vuitton, whatever it might be. We can like really, really master the Abloh-esque way of seeing things. And then eventually we can move past it. And this is what we should be looking to do all the time, I think. We can move past it and create our own unique design language. We can transcend our inspirations and become someone new. And that is a three-step process to becoming a creative, to becoming a designer, in my opinion. And it's evident throughout history, throughout some of the best creatives, the greatest creatives that have ever existed. So this three-stage map is not just for art, but it's a blueprint for anyone creative, anyone trying to be intentional about what it is that we're creating. How do we apply this process, copy, master, transcend, to a brand identity project, or even to curating the perfect morning routine, or into our private lives, for example, right? And it's a practical application that we can put into anything. We can like this copy, mastery, and transcendence. And when we transcend it, that's when someone else will copy us. But we can do these stages with any project. Okay. So it's not, you don't get into the moment of life where you literally just transcend all the time. You're always learning, but you're also always teaching in a way. You get to a point where you're always teaching. This is the romantic, idealized version of it. And that's the rant. That's it done. There was a lot there. It was really dense. A lot of history in there. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this type of episode. If you did, please leave a like. Please subscribe. Please share it with someone else that you think would get something out of this, that you think would enjoy it as well. I'd also love to hear from you if you have any feedback or anything that you'd like me to talk about, any questions, then I'm more than willing to answer them. I get a lot of questions in DMs and things, and I'd love to address those in an episode all at once. So please ask away. I'm trying to be as responsive as possible. And once again, thank you so much for taking the time to listen and spend this time with me. And I will see you all on the next one.